patching thing, and so that's no longer our concern. So I guess in conclusion, like I said before, if you're going to use anything that requires React Native Link, obviously don't use Expo. They are venture backed, so it's all free now, but I wouldn't count on it being free forever. So I would just have that in the back of your mind, like, because they have a bunch of infrastructure they're providing to you, right? I mean, they're like hosting stuff, they provide a build pipeline, all this kind of thing. That's not free, right? So it'll probably be a small fee in the future, but just keep in mind that I don't think it'll be free forever. And then the third thing to keep in mind when using Expo is you have to know how to handle yourself enough in order to be able to eject. Because as with any early stage company, they could just disappear tomorrow and not exist anymore. In which case you'd have to basically do the ejection process and then go back to building a normal React Native project. So if you're okay with all that, I heartily recommend Expo, especially if you're on a small team. Does anybody have any specific questions for me about any of this? I know I kind of bulldozed through a lot of content there at once.
Yeah, so you were talking about how there's no longer the QR code sharing feature in iOS.
Yeah, in iOS.
So how would you test apps? Because I don't really pay attention to Expo, so.
Right. So yeah, so on iOS, basically what you need to do is you can still test apps if you log into the Expo.io account where the app is published. And then from there you can use those links to actually open up the application on, like, so you basically log into Expo.io on your iOS device,
Right.
and then you would basically touch that link on the actual phone that has the Expo client app running, and it would just basically foreground that, and that's how you would do it. Which is not super ideal because you probably don't want to pass around your account credentials to all your QA people, but that's the short-term solution. So, yeah.
So I asked this on Twitter, and it seemed like the answer was no, but I'm going to ask it again because you might have some more insight. Is there a method with Expo that you can use it to prototype it internally with your team? To prototype internally with your team, not prototype. Such that it's not publicly accessible and that it can be like private?
It's okay, so there's two modes when you publish to Expo. There's indexed and non-indexed. So you will have privacy by obscurity if you turn off indexing, but that's the best that you get. Yeah.
Cool.
It'll have some weird URL that nobody knows about, but it is technically publicly accessible.
Just want to check, I'm assuming even though the QR code is gone from iOS, it still works on the iOS simulator?
You mean like the IPA files if you load them up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know how the OTA updates work? The OTA?
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. I don't know the inner workings of it, but basically every time depending on how you have your app configured, either every time or like every couple of times, when the user opens the app, it will actually check to see if there's a new bundle out there. And obviously it can only be JavaScript that changes, right? You can't change any native code. And so basically, on iOS, I think the default is every time it will make sure that they have the most up-to-date version of the app. Sometimes you don't want that because maybe, what if they're away from network connectivity, right? I'm going to try to do that check and it might hiccup. So sometimes you want to do, basically deferred is what they call that mode, where it'll only check if there's actually network connectivity. And so it also helps with first load, right? So if they're always using the N-1 version of the app, that means they always have it and it will always load immediately. So. Anybody else?
I guess less a question, just a comment on our experience at least using ExpoKit.
Mm-hmm.
It's still pretty awesome. I mean, we had to kind of detach pretty early
Yeah, yeah.
and stuff.
What did you have to eject for, if I may ask?
We had a timer. We needed to run a timer in the background.
Ah, yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
The reactivated timer is tied to the
Yep.
UI to do a lock the
Yep.
screen.
Absolutely.
So that was something super simple. There was a couple other things too. So we detached use Expo Kit. The OTAs, especially with the release channels,
Mhm.
since Expo 25 is awesome. And
Yep.
from a QA perspective and QA pipeline, again, if you're not changing a lot of the stuff with the IPA, you just have that there, load it up, get it approved. In the App Store, have a release channel. All your test flight testers can be doing it.
Yeah.
And you can update them in, it takes what, like 2 minutes for it to
Yeah.
build and then publish.
Yeah.
So that's actually been an awesome thing for us. Of course, I mean, you lose some of the,
That is a good point. I should mention Expo apps. Yeah, you can't run background tasks currently. If the app is not foregrounded, it ain't doing anything. So that's a good point.
All right.
Alright, awesome talk. We're going to take a short break while we get the next speaker set up, but we have Kurt and Stan talking about universal components pretty soon, so grab a drink, some more pizza, and we'll let you know when it starts.
Okay.
Just like in your I mean, just like you send that down to everyone. It's like probably.
Oh, cool. You Thanks.
So it wasn't my fault. And it's cool, like,
It's cool that.
tiny bits in your, it was.
Yeah, yeah. You can just kind of because I like I tried to know if I didn't do anything. It's cool, like set up a little like it's pretty sweet. And I mean these little boxes.
Oh, you're not giving any.
Wait, that is like the process in the box. So that's what. Because I mean, wow.
That's the only thing.
Yeah. We ejected.
I had a couple attempts, but this was
So when it launches, it checks. All right, guys, we're getting ready for our next talk, so please take a seat. All right, so we're gonna have Curtis and Samantha here from New York. They both work at the Major League Soccer, and we're going to talk about universal components. So it should be fun. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Welcome. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Sam. This is Kurt.
Yep, I'm Kurt.
And we're from Major League Soccer. And we work on universal components. So this is a parent talk, which is awesome because if something goes wrong, it's his fault. Blame it on him. So yeah, let's get up and running with universal components.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction there, Sam. And before we dive in, real quick, I want to see a show of hands. Has anybody here used universal components before? Has anyone tried to build anything cross platforms? Okay, cool. Has anybody heard about them? Are you interested in them for actually work or applying them, or are you just hey, universal components sound cool? All right, okay.
Looking to apply them.
All right, cool. All right, looking to apply. Yeah, I love seeing adoption. So we've been using them for how long?
A while.
A while. And we learned quite a bit. This has definitely been an interesting road, and so we're definitely going to share that with you here. And so to start it off, I think before we talk about too much about implementation or any of that, I want to take a second to talk about really what makes a universal component. So there's a couple ground rules that you kind of want to follow. They're a bit flexible, but obviously it must be reusable. So what I mean by that is that you should be able to export this component and reuse it across any platform that you're currently supporting. If that's Android, iOS, and web, that's great. If that's VR, that should also be supported. If it's Windows and that's what you're supporting, that's what you need to support. That's what a universal component is. It literally needs to be universal and reusable across any platform without any change to the API. Right? What you import needs to just work everywhere. And it must be a well-designed interface, right? And so we're talking about this a bit more, but I want to lead with this because it's important. You really have to think these things through. Universal components can get in your way. We'll definitely talk about that more, but you really want to think about how you're going to package them, use them, and especially the interfaces that they're going to export. And lastly, they have to be available to all apps, right? So in order to use a universal component, you have to be able to import it from somewhere, right? So that means you have to think about architectural changes. Are you going to use a mono repo and include them locally? Are you going to deploy them? How are you going to get these components from where they live into each app?
So Kurt, this sounds really great. So why not make everything a universal component?
Well, Sam, I'm glad you asked, right? And so it might sound like those are some pretty easy rules to follow, and so at this point we should just dump everything that we have into universal components and try and make everything that we have run cross-platform, right? Why not? Well, there's actually quite a few reasons that you don't want to do that, and the number one reason is it's really harmful to the overall feedback loop. So one of the things that we learned at MLS, we actually did exactly that. We adopted universal components heavily, and we thought we'd be smart, and we worked with the design team, and we're like, yeah, these are definitely things that we'll use cross-platform, and we should just build them now. So we went ahead and started just creating pretty much everything as universal components, and what we found was once we got things into app, because we didn't really sit down and try any of these components out, test them, put them through the weather, we just decided to make them universal components that we deployed, was now that in order to make changes, to make fixes, we had to first update the component in node modules in the app, work on it, make sure it works, copy that into the universal components package, deploy that, re-import that back into the same application, and then test and make sure that that works. That's a huge addition to your feedback loop. That's way different than hitting save and waiting for hot module reloading to update, right? And so it can be detrimental, right? And so that, I just want to set this precedent, great as they are, you have to be very careful. also can cause bottlenecks. If people become dependent on these components and they're waiting for changes, or you decide something's going to be universal, so design goes ahead and adjusts things and we make things generic, but now we have 3 or 4 different pages, screens, whatever you want to call them, depending on these components, you've now created bottlenecks, right? Nobody can move until you're done doing what you need to do. And it creates unnecessary complexity. If a component is not truly universal, if it's not actually being used in 2 apps, but I'm trying to spend all this time deciding how it's going to behave on each platform, thinking about the APIs and how they'll be used by other people, I'm investing a lot of time, I'm creating a lot of unnecessary complexity. I could have built this component probably in a couple minutes, sitting right next to where it's actually being used. And it forces design and UX to essentially be limited to what is available on all platforms. So if I take the approach of I'm going to make everything a universal component, you're kind of like in the world of like React XP, or the idea of like build one app and run anywhere, which is the polar opposite of universal components, which really kind of focuses on like build once and render anywhere. So it's a much different approach, subtle, but it's much different, and it really changes the way that you think about architecture. And just to kind of give an example of like some things that could make good universal components versus things that could make potentially bad ones, you kind of want to try and leave the things that are very platform specific to the platforms. Focus on making like the static components, icons, modal, button, the things that don't involve a lot of complexity, functionality. These are the real wins when it comes to universal components. And honestly, these are the things that are going to align most with your design system or style guide, and the things that will be easier to carry across platforms.
Well, Kurt, some of the things you said didn't sound very good. Why should I use universal components? What are the benefits of it? Well, I know the answer to that question. All right. There's code reuse. I love working with universal components because I no longer have to switch my brain from Swift to Android to JavaScript. I can just keep my mind in JavaScript working across multiple platforms. And let's be a little bit honest, and don't tell my jobless, I can be a little bit lazy, so this is great because there's less work, less coding, and less bug fixes. And what's also key about that is that we can isolate the bugs. So I no longer have to mess with those nasty things with the complexity of the app. I can just focus and hone my skills on that one component. And not only that, management just got a lot easier, right? You no longer need a web team, you no longer need an iOS team, and you no longer need an iOS team. All your developers are like on the same web page. On the same page. And like my manager's like Oprah to the platforms. You get a developer. You get a developer. You get a developer. And it's pretty nice for him at least. So which brings me to my next point: consistency. Right. The development process up front is a lot smoother. When I bring in a universal component into my app, I know it will be bug-free, which creates a layer of abstraction. The next thing with consistency is it builds trust with users. So no matter what platform I'm on as a user, I know that I'm on X, Y, and Z's platform. Like they know that we are on the MLS mobile website or on the MLS regular website. And we're on the MLS mobile app. But getting, go to the next slide. Okay, so making sure that everybody's on board is the hardest part about universal components. Getting everybody to buy into the idea can be difficult. We first had to buy into the idea with the stakeholders, as well as design team, as well as product. Sorry, y'all. I'll get better next time.
You're doing great.
Okay. So like at first we had to talk to the stakeholders and product in a future tense because we didn't want to
we definitely didn't want to try and implement immediately without getting buy-in, because if design and product are on board, you'll hit a ton of roadblocks. If product and design aren't thinking in components and aren't on the same page as you are, it's not just a technical decision. You really, really do need everyone on board to pull this off. If you're not using a design system, if these things aren't in place, you're just going to end up like this hodgepodge kind of mess. And if you try and force this as a technical solution to like make it easier for developers to just reuse code, and you don't have buy-in from other departments and they don't understand what you're trying to accomplish, you'll probably hit quite a few issues.
What he said.
Yeah, so I mean, after talking about some benefits, you know, it's kind of interesting. Like, so it sounds good, right? And it's like, well, then why hasn't anyone really done this before? Why is this something that is new, right? Why are we just getting into this world of like ultimate reusability? And the reason why is because it wasn't possible before you could essentially integrate things like this into apps. So, you know, a lot of people forget that it wasn't until a couple of years ago that we got NPM, that we got module-based JavaScript environments, right? And that we got React and render targets, right? Like this is not something that is new. You could probably pull off reusability in some cool ways. I've actually done like some of them using things like Require, JS and componentizing and stuff, but that is still limited to just the web. So then I've tried to bring things to native via Cordova or PhoneGap, and again, we hit the edges, right? You can't take advantage of anything in the platform. You can only use the features that they choose to support, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, this has never been done before because it's never been possible before. And it takes people in the community to push this forward, right? Tools like React Native Web. I'm not sure, has anybody here heard of React Native Web? Anyone familiar? So React Native Web is a web render target for React Native APIs. So what that means is you use like view, text, image, the React Native primitives, the React Native APIs like animated, you know, netinfo, all these things, they all work, they carry over. So you can take components that you write using those primitives and those APIs, and they'll work on web. And so like, this is how React VR, it's a different render target. That's how we're able to accomplish these things.
Next, we need to set up our environment. We have our tools, we know how to build it. Now we need to set up our environment. So first we start off with making sure it's isolated. We need to make sure that our components are working flawlessly independently. That way, when somebody else uses our component, they don't have to worry about it breaking on them. And it also helps create faster development, because you don't have to wait for the whole app to rebuild. It'll be a little bit faster. Then we have, in order for us to do isolation, we have to use Storybook.js. It's really great because we're able to browse through the components and know which components are available in our library, as well as check all the different states. So if we have like maybe a live state or no data state, we are able to see that in Storybook. It also creates tiered challenges for the team. By that I mean different levels of developers can work on different components. I know when I first came on the team as an entry level, I was lucky enough not to have to work on a button as my first component. But after that, it built a lot of confidence because I was just working on that single component and not having to worry about APIs or the whole app in general. And what's also great, because Kurt mentioned we should not make everything a universal component. So Storybook allows you to develop per platform. So if you need a mobile component, you can actually use React Native Storybook. The next we have improved communication. This is a huge step in setting up your environment, because everybody needs to start thinking in components. Design needs to make style sheets, and product needs to start making tickets and components. We also will have discoverability. So you need to start talking as a whole team, trying to understand what components need to be built and what components need to go in which library. Maybe it needs to be in the web library or not. And then we also have the design system committee, which is great for us. Instead of the whole team having a discussion every day, we have maybe 2 or 3 people who would like being in charge of the universal components. So that way they would talk about what props go in there, do we have a component already to use? And if we design makes an adjustment, we could just adjust our components as well.
Yeah, and so, after you set up an environment, essentially somewhere isolated where you can build and focus on universal components, we're going to take it a little more granular and talk about some practices that we discovered while building actual components that helped us move a lot faster, and some things that caught us up in the beginning. So mainly you want these components to be static components, and so what I mean by that is leave the complexity, leave the control up to the apps. If you have a select component that you want to build and it's going to be universal, make it take the entire list of options and whether or not they're selected. Ideally, like wrap it in a touchable opacity in app and like control on press with that. Like don't our button components have a touchable opacity, and like we're going to remove them or like want to essentially get rid of any type of complexity. You want to keep these components as flat and as static as you possibly can. And the thinking behind that, to clarify, is this. So touchable opacity makes sense right now. It's supported with React's native web. It works with React Native, but like that doesn't always make sense. Like in a VR, there is no touchable opacity. It's like a point and click opacity. So I mean, what do you call that? How does that translate, right? Don't worry about it. Just use whatever React VR supports in React VR, but the button itself can just be wrapped in whatever it needs to be that handler. Like you don't have to actually wrap the handler. And so that was kind of hard for us, like at first, to separate functionality from layout, but it's actually not much different when you think about like data components, right? Like data containers versus just the presentation layer. Take it a step further, right? Like your button is just, it's a view, just something that looks a certain way, and the app decides how it should behave. Another thing is, this is especially why a design system is important. A lot of times, especially if you have a larger engineering team, you can have very similar components, like 2 or 3 different types of the same component. So I'll use an example at MLS. We have something called a story tile. And in different views, it can be like featured with a full background video and title. Other places, it looks more like a card with an image on top and then a card at the bottom with information. And then in lists, it has like a list view, like a very small tile. All those are very similar. They're separate universal components. And when we first built them, they all had totally different APIs. So they were all taking the same props, right? Like they all had to use an image. And one was called image, one was called image_URL, and the other one was called, like, I don't even remember what the third one was called. But the point is that they're like the exact same component. They should have the same API. So that's where the design system or design committee or universal component committee comes into play. You get design thinking about it, other engineers involved, it becomes much easier to align on those things. Overriding styles is absolutely key. And so what I mean by this is focus your styling of universal components inwards, right? It sounds like very meta. But essentially, yeah, you don't want to focus inwards. Leave the container's actual outside styling to the apps. And what I mean is like avoid borders, avoid like flex or width properties or height. Because a component might need to look very different in your mobile app compared to on desktop. And so if you're trying to adjust its sizing, you're going to run into issues. So what we did was just made every universal component except a style prop, and it would just pass that directly onto the root container, like root JSX primitive that we exported from render. Documentation is absolutely key. So you can have all the universal components in the world, and they can be the coolest universal components in the world, but if nobody knows that they're there, nobody is going to use them. So after we had built up a decent amount of components, it quickly became very hard to understand like what was where. Storybook has gotten better about helping this, but you still had to have innate knowledge. Like you had to know essentially what you were looking for. So implementing things like search and stuff like that is key. Descriptions. We also have like boosted up our storybook on steroids essentially. So each prop we have its type, a description, examples of the component using the prop in multiple forms, example code that you can paste in, stuff like that. Also, avoid overexposing. So at first we were like, okay, we have like these node data states of our tiles for before they get data, like our skeleton UIs. We're like, well, that's a separate component, so we'll export that. We'll also export the tile, and then in the app, we'll see if we're loading or not, and then we'll render one, or otherwise we'll render the other. It seemed like a really good idea, like to give that kind of control to the app as well, but what we found out is that essentially we just recreated that in every single app. It didn't seem like the right layer of exposure, and so we ended up rolling the node data state into the component itself, and then once it got the data, it would know how to handle it. Okay, I don't have like any of these props, so clearly I don't have what I need. I'll be a skeleton until these props come in. And that was a much better API. It was much easier for developers to understand how to use as well, and it kind of abstracted the complexity. And, this is like totally off topic, but abstractions are a real pain in the ass, and they're very hard to get right. Just and lastly, like just treat your universal components like a third-party library. Like treat this like you're about to release it onto GitHub and put it out on Twitter, and you want everyone to come and look at it. So that means you better have documentation, you better have tests. The API should be thought about. How will this be used, you know, in different areas and all that kind of stuff. You really want to like focus on making it as abstracted and away from like how you deal with your app as possible. A universal component should be, you know, essentially treated like a third-party package.
All right, so now we know how to use it. We are going to optimize as well. What's great about React Native, it actually has a lot of things built in for us already. Like we can use platform file extensions. We have a video player as one of our components, and we, on the web, it takes the HTML5 player, whereas on mobile, it can't do that. So what's cool about this is the app will actually know to look for either, if I'm on web, it will look for a web.js file, and if it doesn't have that, it will just default to .js. Then we also have platform primitives. These are great too, especially when it comes to styling. Sometimes Android and iOS kind of wouldn't give us the same style, so we were able to like isolate which OS we're on to kind of target maybe like the headers too long in Android, so we're able to target that style.
And a real quick fun fact, React Native Web adds web as the OS, so you can target like iOS, Android, or web.
That too. And then what's also great, like I said, it's kind of lazy, I'm a lazy worker. There's also universal component compatible packages, so you can just steal other people's work and put it inside of your app.
Yeah, and I mean, that's it. Like, that's essentially what we have as far as like slides and code and information. So I didn't really have time to prepare like a full example, but I don't like not showing code. So we're actually just going to like dig into MLS, and we're going to show you essentially how we package up the universal components, how we import them into different apps, and stuff like that.
And you can pick up the app next week when it comes out.
Yeah, it's actually coming out pretty soon. Hashtag whoop whoop. I don't know what I'm doing. Let's see what we got here. All right, anything that you see here is, I don't know, view at your own risk. All right. Nope, nope, nope. I'll blow up the font, don't you worry. Let's see, what do I even have here? Live Darwin. Oh, I don't even have anything checked out. We're going to have to go to GitHub, folks. I got to put this in.
Are you okay with live stream on this?
Huh? Yeah, I mean, we don't
If
have
not,
any,
I
like,
can pause it.
secret
That's why I
keys.
asked.
Yeah, there's like nothing secret in there.
Okay.
I'm actually like trying to get this entire thing open source. I think would be really cool. It's not. So let's. All right. So sorry. Get a. And then I'll blow up the old font. All right. Okay, so the first place that we're actually going to go is UI packages. So UI packages is a learner repo, and this has, oh look, there you are, Sam. So essentially, fun fact, here's the link right to our universal components package. So every time that we deploy or merge to master, the CI builds Storybook for us and deploys it to Surge. And so as you can see, all package exports. Here we have a name, list of all the packages, all the things that we export, and then we've broken them up into categories. Here's primitives, arrow, button. I know it's a little small. Sorry about that. Fade in image. Hey, so pretty. Heading. All right, so like the point here is that these are all like very static, very primitive things. Nothing here that's like, does a lot, right? Nothing that does a lot. So let's jump back in. So that is actually under packages, React components. So this is it, right? This is just a package, and in this components directory, I mean, it largely matches what was in Storybook. It's just a bunch of components. And so then what we do is we take those components and bring them in here. And, node modules, MLS digital, React components, right? So just import them. This should be bam. Actually, let's just do this. Source. Let's see if buy tickets uses anything. Buy tickets. Here we go. Import icon and SeatGeek logo from MLS Digital React components, right? And I mean, that's like, let me get rid of this terminal. Close off. No. Where's my escape button? It's gone. Command B. There we go. Is that big enough? Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we have icon, right? This is like one of our components. So if we come down here, somewhere in here, I swear there's probably an icon. I swear there is. I'm not getting an ESLint error, so there must be. There we go, icon.tickets. Cool. So that like is just an SVG React component that works cross-platform, and it's there. And so I could, I guess we can go back to GitHub real quick. We'll go Major League Soccer, and we'll hit up schedule. This is scores and schedule. This is a web UI. This actually goes to matchcentermlssoccer.com. That's that repo that I'm in is this site. So this date picker here, calendar icon, those are also universal components. And this is actually the same one that's in the mobile app. So when you're on the scores page in the mobile app and you're flipping through the dates, you get that same date picker component. So if we actually want to see that, we can go back here. We won't deal with the source. We'll go back to the UI packages. And then we'll go, date picker. Let's take a look at it.
Here's my face again.
There's my face again. Hey, Sam. And boom. So let's look at the render, right? So we've got some views, and we got a calendar list. So this is us. Look, this is actually React Native calendars. So this is us using React Native calendars on native and web. So it's not one way, right? It's not just about using like web things on native or just native on web. Like it opens up both ecosystems. It doesn't open up fully, but it does open up a lot. Anything that was built for native but is pure JS, most likely will work on web too. And what I found is like a lot of things, if I want to use them, the maintainers are like super happy about getting it to work with web. They're like, yeah, we would love that. That's great. Take PRs. Yeah, so I mean that's it. That's essentially what we got. But the point is, universal components can be really awesome, and they can also be a really big pain in the butt, right? Yeah. That's it. Wraps it up.
Any questions?
Any questions? Oh, that's a question.
Questions, comments, concerns. Okay, you want to field the first one, and then I'll take one? Or?
I'll try.
All right, go ahead. I think, Rafael,
I was curious about the part where you were talking about Storybook. What are your favorite add-ons to use with Storybook?
That's a really good question that I'm so glad that you asked. I don't think we use any. We used to use, what's the one that like lets you like define the props parameters?
Knobs?
Knobs. We used to use knobs, and then we got rid of it. And instead what we do is we list out each prop, we list out its type, we give a description of it, and we show examples of it in use. And then we have code samples that you can just pull out, paste in the app. Way better than knobs.
I'm looking at your storybook and it's still there.
Huh?
I'm looking at your storybook right now and knobs is still
Most of it's
there.
gone.
Oh, most of it's gone, so we haven't fully got rid of it. There's probably a couple things to use it, but definitely trying to migrate away from it, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the only one that, oh, there's one other one, background colors we use, because we have certain components that have like a white background, and it sucks to have them on white.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but honestly, and that's not to say Storybook add-ons are bad. That's not what I'm advocating here. I'm just saying that we don't make use of a lot of them. And then we tried the GraphQL add-on, but instead just like added Apollo, and
Yeah.
it just worked just fine.
We get live data now, so.
Yeah, we got live data. Yeah. What? Live data in our components, and then we can deploy them, and then everyone can see them and test them. It's pretty cool. I'm sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just wondering, as you have strived to make more universal components, has your testing process or testing framework or the way you've written tests changed?
No, so I mean, we're very shallow, like most of the universal components especially are pretty static, so snapshots tend to do 90% of the job. You know, and there's an add-on, but I think now it's actually integrated. Storybook snapshots, that's a great add-on. And then, yeah, so yeah, no, we, Atticus, did you have a question?
Yeah, so would you describe your universal components as mainly like building block pieces, not really like, I don't know, central UI pieces, but like you got the icons, you got like the buttons, those are kind of like you think of like the atomic design principles, you got your atoms, your molecules.
The primitives,
so, yeah, exactly, your smaller pieces, but not so much further along the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, we try to let the app do most of the work versus the actual, so they're like building block pieces versus like, maybe we have like a to-do list, we're not gonna import the whole to-do list somewhere, because it kind of limits the functionality of the app and whole.
We tried. We got into some squirrely spots. Like the platforms are different, and they should be, right? Like you should want to do different things on web than you want to do on mobile. That's fine. That's great. It's actually good. That's the benefit of React Native. That's why I love universal components. Like, don't do that stuff in universal components. Just UI. Just focus on building like boxes, squares, and text, and get it into apps. You know, that's where you're gonna get the most reuse, because everything else is so specific. Even if you don't want it to be, it is. Even if you can genericize it enough, you're creating complexity for it.
Yeah. So going back off on that real quick, you mentioned I think modal was like an example.
Yeah.
So I think it might be Semantic React or like the AMP design package for React. They have this nice pattern of say like a row or a card, and you have this card component, and then when you want to add the title, you actually add like card.title as the child. I'm not sure if there's a good term for that, like design system language.
Yeah.
But that seemed like a good way to take this larger component that has a lot of subsections that maybe you do need specific styles based on your platform. Have you used an approach like that so you can target styles to further descendants in your?
Yeah, so two things. Yes, good question, two things in there. One is the first thing that we try to avoid anything, like again, there are certain cases when you want to dig deep, but we found that most times you can accomplish that with the platform.os separation and handle that internally as opposed from externally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like when styles are focused inwards, they should be 100% controlled by the universal component. Now, as far as laying it out and stuff, and again, this is just what we did. It's not like some golden rule, but you know. And then as far as layout goes, that is the app's problem. But if you try it, if your app needs to change the way the component looks, other than the platform's messing it up, it's not universal. It means it's not the same on both platforms.
It's good litmus test.
Yeah. Sorry, Jake, was it?
How do you manage styles?
That's a good question. We just use StyleSheet. So StyleSheet is a React Native API, and it's supported in React Native Web. So right now, that is essentially what we do.
Does that recreate any of the stuff that we're used to in CSS system?
Yeah, so what React Native Web does under the hood is basically, essentially, manipulate React DOM to make it behave, and just apply the base styles to everything in the DOM to make it behave the way that it does on React Native. So what that means is like all of your views or divs, like if you actually want to use DOM primitives, all your divs are flex by default with the direction set to column and like all those other things that like you find in React Native. And it should error if you try and break out of React Native styles.
Do you have like
selector inheritance and all that stuff?
Yeah, so no, that's another good thing. I actually forgot to mention something I want to add here is that you really want to get your designers thinking about mobile first, and then that also sounds like an app problem, not a universal component problem. So if a component needs different states, you handle that with like a prop, and then in web on hover, you know, or whatever, you like change that prop. It does take it away from CSS and move it into JavaScript, but like we're already, you know, very deep in JavaScript land. Yeah, but again, that's a perfect case of like keeping the component itself static, making sure it can render in any way based off of its props, thinking about its API, knowing it will need to look different on web and mobile, and then letting web and mobile handle how it gets those props themselves. Any other questions?
What do you use for testing?
So Jest, we use Jest. I'm sorry? Yeah, mostly snapshots, but you can use other things. So like, you get into this issue because there's no like DOM, so you can't simulate events, but there's nothing saying that I can't take Enzyme, grab a component, and then literally just call on press. And then you can like add a promise that just resolves, that's going to clear the whole stack. That means set will be state will be set, so then you can then continue on to test like the updates. So you can get that deep coverage, but again, you can do different things in the apps. It's only about the universal components, and if you keep functionality and complexity out of them, then you're really just testing UI, which means snapshots get you all the way there.
So do you use a monorepo for like handling the different environments, or are you?
So no, we use mono repos, but we just use the mono repo for all of our packages. The apps live in their own repos. They have like very complicated build processes. And for our CI/CD, it just makes it easier to have them in their own repos. And we deploy the universal components to NPM as an NPM package, and then we import that into the application. And that gives the added benefit that you get sendbar. So if we have to push some critical fix for React Native, but we don't quite need it yet on web, and we don't have the bandwidth to get it done, we don't have to update everywhere. We can just update the version in one, make the updates we need, and then when it comes time to update web, when we have the bandwidth, we can do it. Yeah.
Storybook is it generally more popular and more used than React Style Guides? And also, second question is, what's the Lerna setup like? Is it like a long process to version all of your components?
What did you compare Storybook to? I'm sorry.
Style Guidance is
Yeah,
like another
React
story.
Style Guidance.
I find it easy just to use Storybook. I mean, it's growing as a community, so I would use it.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't dug deep into Style Guide, so I can't really say pick one over the other. I'm sure that both accomplish the goal that need to be accomplished. You know, do some research, check it out. Yeah, and then sorry, what was this? There was a second part. Lerna. Lerna's pretty simple. It's actually, honestly, if you manage multiple NPM packages, like it will actually make your life a lot easier. Like we don't just deal with like UI, like at MLS. We actually have a ton of NPM packages. So we're trying to move more and more of them into Lerna.
Because I think we're actually, we need to get to that now. Because
Yeah.
we have the components, we have Style Guides, but
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. I mean, you know, it's like, there's no golden rule again, right? Like, don't use it till you need it, and then, yeah, when you do, use it. Any more questions?
You guys, it looks like you guys have platform-specific components that
Yes.
you want to behave similarly. You want to have a similar like API for them, basically, across platforms, even though they're implemented differently. Do you get that through using Flow, or do you think it would be beneficial if React had a system for like interfaces, sort of like OOP has?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, that's an interesting question. So it's actually like a higher level than that. So like we don't need the interface because it's at the file level. And so on web, Webpack is checking for the file extensions. And so if we need a specific implementation, we put it in whatever file name .web.js. And then we can have the exact same like component name imported in the mobile app, but it will know to then look for either iOS or Android or .js. And so that's kind of, we take it a step higher. Like normally if you're in the code, like if the functionality is so, and honestly we're not doing that for different functionality, we're doing that because it's like just a totally different component we need to render. The only one we have really done that so far is video, and that's just because like you cannot do the same thing on both platforms.
Right, I meant more like along the lines of like ensuring that like the props are all named the same way.
Oh, we have a design committee for that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So it's just manually kind of.
It's manually agreed upon, and then that's what goes into the ticket, essentially, that deals with the components, and then whoever gets that knows, that that's the API that they should follow. But again, it's a process, rotating, right? It's like, shouldn't be left up to the same people to figure out all of them. It's nice to like disseminate that information and all that stuff, but
Going right off of you, Gabriel. So there's no way to like establish a contract between those 3 different platform implementations, though, in terms of the prop types and.
no, so that's the thing. From UI, UX, and API, that component needs to behave exactly the same. So the props need to be the same, the way it looks needs to be the same, and the way it behaves needs to be the same. The underlying implementation is what's allowed to change, if that makes sense.
So for the public side, would you define like one prop type that's all different
Yes.
platform files are gonna be?
100%, because in all honesty, if it is a universal component, what's actually different about it is just how it's rendering. It should behave the same, which means it should work perfectly fine with the exact same props on all platforms, right? Like there should be no change. The change is just like what actually renders. That's the change. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you guys for your time.
Yes. One more thing real quick, I want to give a shout out to Sam here. She made all those slides, in Illustrator.
Nice.